United States Army announced that they were reducing the overall force from 494,000 on active duty to 470,000 on active duty. A bit of a shock to a lot of us who've been around for a while. Post Desert Storm, there was a massive downsizing. A lot of active duty forces and responsibilities were moved to the National Guard and the reserves. And the active duty force dropped down to about 495,000, give or take a little bit. Now, during the wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially around 2007, if you all remember, it was called the Surge. There was an authorized increase where the Army was authorized because of the op tempo and the number of people we had deployed and trying to have folks recover and come back to the States and moving pieces everywhere. There was an authorized increase for a short period of time. I think they capped out at the highest. We were probably at about 525-ish. In the last few years, though, as we've talked about on this show, and I'm sure most of you have read or seen in the news, the Army, not just the Army, but specifically in this case, the Army has missed its recruiting goal for the last 2 years, consecutive years of minus 15,000 new recruits. So the Marines have hit their number the last couple of years with a little bit to spare 2 years ago, and just made the edge, made their number last year. Space Force, newest of the services, made their number last year. But all the other services missed. Navy, Air Force, I think even the Coast Guard, and definitely the Army missed. But the Army's 2 years in a row of minus 15,000. So current strength is under, well under the 494,000, which is the current authorization. And what we've got is a significant number of mid-grade billets or manning spaces that are empty. The Army has also done a reevaluation of its needs, and based on the type of war or conflict that they anticipate fighting. So the drop in from 494,000 to 470,000 is mostly cuts. In fact, almost all of it is cuts to empty spaces that currently exist. So they're not getting rid of soldiers. They're not asking soldiers to leave. And what they're doing is cutting away empty positions, right? So it's not a manning loss. There are no soldiers being sent away or sent home. What it is a loss in the overall document, never to be refilled. So those 24,000-ish slots are just going away. And so where are they taking from? So I mentioned that the Army has done a reevaluation of what war they anticipate fighting or the type of warfare they anticipate conducting. So in their infinite wisdom, and this is very reminiscent to the late 1970s, post-Vietnam, the Army has decided that they're going to focus on large-scale conflict. And I've said it a number of times, we haven't done a good job of determining who our greatest threat is, and therefore how we're going to man and equip our Army and then train it to fight a specific, our most deadly foe. It looks like the Army, or at least DOD as a whole, has decided it is going to be large-scale conflict, which points directly to Russia, China, potentially North Korea as well, but definitely Russia and most likely China. So where is the Army cutting from? Well, when you fight large-scale conflict and you've got to focus on that, you cut away from small-scale conflict. You cut away from counterinsurgency, which is what we've been doing actively and consistently for the past 23 years. Our Army, its current organizational structure, its current promotional timeline and guidelines and experience base, for those of us that participated in the shooting wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was all counterinsurgency. That's what we were all doing. It wasn't reserved for special operators, although that was their mission before the war started, but it became everybody's mission. Counterinsurgency was it. Again, very, very much like the post-Vietnam era, where the Army did the same thing. I could tell you that in 2005-06, I attended the Army Staff College, and we were developing a new counterinsurgency manual for the Army. That counterinsurgency manual was new, and the best thing going, because it was the war we were fighting and we identified it. But we also identified that a significant portion of what that manual is based on were things that were thrown away in 1975 because the Army decided, well, Vietnam's over with and we're never going to fight that type of war again. But fast forward a little bit, Balkans, Somalia, Desert Storm was definitely not an insurgency, counterinsurgency, or a small war. But the entire global war on terrorism is essentially small war style, counterinsurgency style, and very special operations focused. They're the ones who have done the heavy lifting in a lot of cases, especially in the last 2 years after we shut down Afghanistan. But in the early days of Afghanistan and in the waning days of Afghanistan, and a good portion of Iraq, special operations forces were the focus of counterinsurgency capability. We have decided to cut away from that in the Army's infinite wisdom. So where are they cutting from? The Army's just determined, my last combat tour in 2013, 14, or correction, 12, 13 was as a special, Security Forces Advise and Assist Team Commander. So I was in Eastern Afghanistan commanding a team of 18 folks. And what we were doing was advising and assisting the Afghans to take over as their own security force, their own military. Obviously, this is 8 or 9 years before the horrible exfil out of Kabul that we all watched on television in horror. But that's what we were doing. We were trying to work ourselves out of a job, and as a result of that, the Army took conventional forces, guys like me. I was not a special operator. I was a conventional infantryman, and they built these advise and assist teams from folks like me. They trained us to do the job, and then they sent us over there to do it. After that, the Army decided, hey, this is a capability that we need to have, and we're probably going to need to have for the long haul. This is a mission that's never going to go away, no matter what we're doing. Well, that's exactly some of the force structure that they're cutting away. There are security force advisory brigades, SFABs, that are being downsized, shrunk. That capability is being minimized. We're also cutting away something that we refer to as civil affairs, and some other special operations capabilities that are less about shooting and more about advising and assisting native nation forces, to take over their own security. But again, it's the same lesson learned over and over again. We did it in 1975-ish, post-Vietnam. We decided we're never going to do this again. We're now doing it again in 2024. We decided, well, we're never going to do this again. So we're cutting it away. Or at least that's what it seems on the surface. I would tell you there's probably two other things going on. One, we are never, until there is a large-scale shooting war, we are never going to be authorized, the military, the Army itself, is never going to be authorized another massive increase, or an increase to go back to even pre-Desert Storm level numbers. We can't maintain it with an all-volunteer Army, as demonstrated in the last 2 years of recruiting. So we're never going to get that big, or be allowed to get that big again, until the war starts, until the big war starts, in which case we'll be scrambling. There's potential for the draft to be enacted. But regardless of all that, we will never be a large Army pre-1990 numbers again. So you have to prioritize, and that's what the Army's doing. And again, it is very reminiscent of the 80s, where we decided that the Soviets were the threat. We were going to build our military to fight the Soviets. We were going to build all of our manning to fight the Soviets. We were going to train to fight the Soviets. That's what we were going to do. We've done the same thing over again. And because our Army is even smaller than it was in the 80s, we've had to really, really prioritize where our active duty forces are going to focus. And the decision has been, and is, we are going to focus on large-scale conflict. We're going to focus on tank-on-tank and updated new technology, drone, anti-drone type fights. There are some capabilities that we developed, which is a wheeled mobile infantry capability based on the Striker vehicle. That's Striker with a Y if you've never seen one before. They're going to start cutting some of those away because it's not conducive to a lot of large-scale fighting. Great troop movement, very fast, very quiet, but the armor is very, very light, and it's not going to stand up to a tank or a armored personnel carrier type shooting war. So they're cutting away some of that. Again, this is about prioritization. What is most important if we have to fight someone like China, someone like Russia, someone like North Korea? If we're going to max out the capability of our active duty force, where are we going to focus it? And that's where we've decided we're going to focus. So we're cutting away some special operations capability. We're cutting away some mobility assets that aren't heavily armored and wouldn't necessarily be as useful. I'm not saying not useful, not as useful in the numbers that we currently have them against a foe like China or Russia. So we're cutting some of those away, and we're focusing more on drone, anti-drone technology because that's going to be a big part of the fight. I would tell you there's also something else going on. There's a lot of optics that are being catered to. When you miss your recruiting goal by 15,000 2 years in a row, and you are not even meeting your manning requirement, it is very easy to say, change the manning requirement. We're right now we're more than 24,000 under strength. We're 30,000-ish under strength, give or take a little bit. So reduce it. Reduce the end strength number, and then you're not that far off. So in my opinion, there's a shell game that's going on right now. There's a little bit of cover your ass going on by the administration, a little bit of cover your ass going on by the DOD, and by, unfortunately, the current Army Chief of Staff has been left with this. This is a mess made by people before him, decisions made by people before him. And I'm going back not just the last Chief of Staff or the last two Chiefs of Staff, although they bear the brunt of it. But there were some decisions made even before that that affect this. And the General George, the current Chief of Staff of the Army, is kind of left to make decisions to rectify some of this stuff. And that's unfortunately what he's been tasked to do. But I think there's a bit of a shell game going on. I think we are hiding some of the manning issues by just flat out changing the balance sheet. If you're short 30,000, but you reduce the end number by 24,000, suddenly you're only short 6,000, and it looks a hell of a lot better. So I don't know how much of that played into this. My gut says it's a pretty significant number. When we cut away mid-level, multi-year, the folks that have the Manning document says, based on this rank structure, mid-grade leadership, junior to mid-grade NCOs and junior to mid-grade officers, those that have been in for 6 to 8 years to 10 years, and they're unfilled, so we cut them away. What that does is it shortens the opportunity for the new junior generation for their advancement. So, I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense on the surface, but if you cut out the availability of mid-grade rank in certain numbers, then when the new generation comes in and it's infinitely harder for them to get promoted because there's a limitation on how many of them can get promoted and how quickly, then you start to have retention issues. Then you start to have soldiers who, normally a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, would have enlisted and then re-enlisted because they have the potential to continue to grow and be promoted and lead soldiers and become leaders. Now, when it becomes infinitely harder and they have less of an opportunity to get promoted in their specific career field, they do one enlistment and they get out. So my anticipation is that while we're shortening the Manning document and we're cutting out empty slots as they are now to kind of make up for our recruiting problem, we're going to end up having a retention problem in the next few years. So I think this is, you know, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I think, you know, probably 5 to 6 years from now, again, a new chief of staff of the Army later, we're going to have a different set of problems to deal with. And hopefully we are not, and hope is not a course of action, but that's kind of where we're at. Hopefully we're not in the middle of fighting a fairly sizable shooting war when that happens. So keep an eye on that. If you're concerned, and you should be, you know, that the Army, the military has been professing capabilities to fight multiple foes on multiple fronts, multiple locations across the globe. A reduction in end strength does not make that possible. It actually makes it much more difficult. In fact, I would tell you it makes it impossible. You probably need to start talking to your congressman and start asking the hard questions of how are we really going to fix this to continue to provide defense for this nation, because it's not by reducing the Army number overall if you're worried about a large-scale foe in China who has a military 10 times the size of ours. Us getting smaller is not helping that. It's not an easy nut to crack, but we all need to start asking questions of our elected officials to find out what they really believe to be the plan and if there is even a plan. My guess is right now they're developing a plan and a long-term strategy. It's just not done yet. And I think that this most recent move to reduce 24,000 off the end strength of the Army was a really poor, rash decision. But and I think it was done for optics, which I think is a real shame. So we'll see what happens. I certainly, as a retiree and somebody who's still on the recall rolls, will definitely be keeping an eye on this. Hopefully it'll never come to that, but it is something that we should all pay attention to. My assumption is that this is probably going to start happening in the other services as well, if it hasn't already. So for all you former Marines, airmen, you know, sailors out there, probably take a look at your own service. You know it better than I do. I just happen to know the Army really well. Just check out what's going on out there, and you may find the same disturbing trends going on in